There's a certain kind of person who learned very early on that if something needed to be done, no one else was coming to do it for them. And if that sounds familiar, then you're exactly where you need to be. Because by the end of this, you're going to understand why you think the way you do, why you move the way you do, and why you've always felt just a little out of step with everyone else. There's a generation that didn't just grow up, they adapted. They weren't guided step by step, they weren't constantly reassured, and they definitely weren't monitored every minute of the day. They were the kids who let themselves into quiet houses after school, the ones who learned how to fill silence before they ever learned how to avoid it. They made their own food, handled their own problems, and figured out emotions without anyone translating them. And if you zoom out for a second, you'll notice something strange. They're rarely the focus of cultural conversations. Wedged between louder, more discussed generations, they became almost invisible. But that invisibility shaped them in ways that most people don't immediately recognize. To really understand how this mindset formed, you have to go back to those quiet afternoons. The empty homes weren't just a detail, they were a training ground. Research has shown that children raised with that level of independence developed a unique mix of self-reliance and emotional distance. It wasn't labeled as neglect at the time, it was simply normal. Keys hung around their necks, dinners were reheated in microwaves, and hours passed without adult supervision. There was no one to narrate what was happening. No one to soften the edges of reality. And in that space, something powerful took root. The ability to be alone without fear. That ability didn't just stay in childhood, it carried forward into everything. It influenced how they approached relationships, how they dealt with stress, and how they made decisions. Because when you grow up solving your own problems, you stop expecting rescue. You stop waiting. You act. But what's interesting is that this independence didn't come without a psychological shift that most people misunderstand. There's a tendency to look at this generation and assume they're pessimistic, that they expect things to go wrong. But that's not quite accurate. What they developed is something psychologists call defensive pessimism. It's not about negativity, it's about readiness. Instead of assuming everything will work out, they prepare for the possibility that it won't. Not because they're cynical, but because experience taught them that things can fall apart without warning. Economic instability, shifting job markets, broken systems, these weren't abstract concepts. They were lived realities. So instead of leaning into blind optimism, they built contingency plans. And here's the part that often gets missed. It works. While others chase constant positivity, trying to manifest perfect outcomes, this approach quietly builds resilience. It reduces shock, lowers emotional fallout, and creates a sense of control. It's not about expecting failure, it's about not being caught off guard by it. That same mindset extends into how they protect themselves emotionally. There's a reason they don't immediately open up, a reason they don't share everything about their lives. It's not coldness, it's strategy. They grew up watching what happens when too much is exposed. Relationships that fell apart publicly, careers that unraveled under pressure, trust that was broken without warning. So they learned to keep certain things close. Privacy became a form of safety. And then there's the humor. If you've ever noticed the sarcasm, the dry wit, the tendency to turn even serious situations into something slightly ironic, that's not accidental. It's a coping mechanism. When you can laugh at something, you create distance from it. You reduce its power. Humor becomes armor, a way to process without being overwhelmed. This is also why silence doesn't bother them. In a world where constant noise has become the norm, where people feel the need to fill every moment with conversation or content, they're comfortable stepping back. Silence isn't awkward. It's useful. It's where they think, where they reset, where they process. And that brings us to something that often surprises people. Despite their reserved nature, despite their tendency to keep things internal, they are some of the most dependable individuals you'll encounter. Not loud about it, not performative, but consistent. They don't announce their work ethic. They don't broadcast their efforts. They just do what needs to be done. Studies have shown that they score high in self-control and delayed gratification, which means they're willing to put in effort now for results later. They're not chasing immediate recognition, they're focused on long-term value. This is why you'll often find them in positions of quiet influence, not necessarily the loudest voice in the room, but often the one making things happen behind the scenes. They're not trying to be seen, they're trying to be effective. And yet there's a paradox here that confuses people. On one hand, they value independence deeply. On the other, they are incredibly loyal. They may not constantly check in, they may not always express things verbally, but when it matters, they show up. They won't always ask for help, but they'll offer it without hesitation. They won't always say they care, but their actions make it clear. They don't need an audience to validate what they do. In fact, the idea of broadcasting every good deed feels unnecessary to them. Loyalty, in their view, is something you demonstrate, not something you announce. This ties back to how they approach problem solving. Before reaching out to others, they tend to look inward first. They research, they analyze, they try to figure things out independently. This isn't about avoiding people, it's about trusting their own ability to find answers. They grew up in a time where information wasn't instantly accessible. You had to look for it, spend time with it, work to understand it. And because of that, learning wasn't passive, it was active. It required effort, which made it stick. That process shaped how they think. They don't just absorb information, they evaluate it. They're naturally skeptical, not in a dismissive way, but in a thoughtful one. They've seen trends rise and fall, seen certainty turn into doubt, seen experts be wrong. So they rely on their own judgment because they had to develop it early. And now there's a new layer to all of this, because the same people who grew up this way are now raising children in a completely different environment. A world of constant supervision, structured schedules, and immediate access to everything. And something about it feels unfamiliar to them. They watch their kids navigate a reality that is more guided, more monitored, more protected. And part of them questions it. They notice differences in resilience, in independence, in how challenges are handled. But this raises an important question, one that doesn't have a simple answer. Are they trying to give their children a better, safer experience? Or are they reacting to their own past, trying to correct something that still affects them? Because there's a fine line between protecting someone and preventing them from developing strength. Some have found a balance. They provide guidance without control, support without overstepping. They allow room for mistakes, for learning, for growth. Others are still navigating that balance, figuring out where to step in and where to step back. And that's part of the story too, because no generation gets everything perfectly right. Each one adjusts, adapts, learns as it goes. So if any of this feels familiar, if you recognize yourself in the independence, the quiet resilience, the way you approach the world, then here's something worth holding on to. You don't need to explain why you prefer space over noise. You don't need to justify why you'd rather figure things out on your own. You don't need to apologize for not sharing every detail of your life. The way you were shaped has value. The ability to stand on your own, to think critically, to show up without needing recognition, that's not something to minimize. It's something to understand. And if something in this connected with you, don't rush past it. You don't need to turn it into a post or a conversation. Just sit with it for a moment. Let it settle. Because sometimes understanding yourself doesn't come from adding more noise. It comes from finally recognizing what's been there all along.